Now, Alex, I'm going to turn things over to you to talk about the where. Where we work was one of the first impacts that we all felt as a result of the pandemic. But the questions around where we work and the legal implications as they relate to where we work have evolved. Guide us through that, please. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And before I really dive in, just want to take a moment with everyone to take a look at this picture. And thank you again for being here today when maybe some of you could be somewhere else living that kind of remote work reality.
Alex, I have to jump back in. Every time I see this picture, I just feel like crying. Anyway, back to you.
And so on that note, really, as Laura said, this was one of the first things that a lot of employers really noticed and turned their minds to as everybody was scrambling to figure out how they were going to deal with the first initial shutdown in many jurisdictions across Canada. What employers really are going to need to keep in mind as we keep navigating the assortment of questions related to where we work is the fact that the return to the workplace is going to vary. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. So really what I'm going to be covering in this segment isn't going to be a plan for any one workplace or any one category of workplaces, but it's really the things to keep in mind when you are formulating your own plan. And what your return to the workplace is going to look like is going to depend on a combination of factors, many of which are unfortunately, and perhaps there's some benefit to it, still evolving. So the entire end game isn't set yet. Employers have time, but there may already be certain things that you've noticed over the, I was going to say few months, but I guess 14 plus months that we have now been in the pandemic situation. In our practice, what we've seen is that a lot of employers may wish to reduce costs. You may be in a situation like we are, where you have thousands of square feet of workspace and not any employees to fill it with just because of the current pandemic situation. And for some employers, they may think, well, I'm paying very expensive rental costs on real estate downtown, an office on Bay Street in Toronto, or the financial district of any city across the country, and maybe I don't want to do that anymore because it doesn't work for me. What employers have also found has been a positive of the pandemic is that really in a lot of ways, the pandemic has boosted employment mobility in such a way that employers can now really access a wider pool of talent. And with new technologies that have been worked on probably more than they would have been in a different sort of scenario, things like Zoom and Teams and the transition to online filing of documents, online signing of documents on a regular basis, the security measures and technologies to do with that, employers are finding that they can work, that they can operate their workplaces well, perhaps beyond locally, provincially, nationally, sometimes internationally. And that's something that some may still want to take advantage of when the possibility of a return to their previous centralized workplace becomes a long-term reality. Employees, as we've heard in some previous segments, may be wanting increased flexibility. Some employees are finding that they're, feel personally that they're working well at home. They like being able to work slightly different hours that they've negotiated with their employer, which, if the employer knows about it and has agreed to it, could be okay, could have some issues, as we've touched on. But additionally, a lot of employees may challenge the return to the office. Others may challenge not returning to the office. With respect to the return to the physical offices, one thing that employers are really going to need to keep in mind as you're formulating your plans is that a lot of employees have moved in the last year. There have been, lots of reports now tracking the exodus of young people, especially those who would be of working age, from city centers over the last few months to go to places where they can, buy property, have a little bit more space. And these employees are making assumptions about the future of their workplaces that perhaps may not be the same assumptions that employers are making. So we actually had a situation that we dealt with a few months ago where an employee came to the employer and said, I'm having difficulties with my mental health. I'm having concerns about being at home by myself in my apartment in Toronto. I'm going to be moving in with my parents. And the issue that this employer was faced with was that this employee's parents lived 4.5 hours drive away. And the employer intended to return its employees to the physical workspace in the future. How did that all pan out? I will tell you later on in the presentation, so hold on to that story. But all of these sorts of circumstances and the kinds of things that employers and employees have been thinking of and feeling lead us to the sort of other key considerations that I want to cover with you. The first is that any sort of change with respect to where we're conducting work could result in potential constructive dismissal exposures. And as Seth said in our first segment today, constructive dismissal refers to when an employer is unilaterally changing a fundamental term of employment. Where we work is a very fundamental term of employment to a lot of employment relationships. And so a variety of changes here can lead to constructive dismissal risks. Often there are, opposing sides to both things. So for example, in certain circumstances, employees who have been working from home for a while, a year, 14 months, some employees who employers have hired on may actually have only ever worked remotely, because certainly recruitment has happened during the pandemic. Certainly there are employees who've never really seen the physical office. They've never interacted with their colleagues. And so when an employer calls those employees back to the office and says, well, now we're going to be working in this, fixed location, we expect you to be here, let's say 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, employees may think, well, that's not really what I thought I agreed to. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's in accordance with the terms of my employment. And they may claim that their employment has therefore been terminated. The other side that we've increasingly been seeing, but that hasn't really been talked about as much publicly, is that there are actually a lot of employers who are facing pushback from employees who don't want to stay at home. There are employees who, have dealt with the pandemic by setting up temporary home offices, but it doesn't work for them. They may not have the space in their home. They may just not really enjoy working by themselves in isolation without their coworkers, or having to devote a space in their home to work when that's not what they thought that they'd signed up for. And these employees as well could make a claim of constructive dismissal if they aren't allowed to come back to the workplace once the current pandemic and sort of emergency situation is over. Because while some employees have been understanding of changes that the employer has implemented given the pandemic context, once the pandemic is over or once the situation has quite improved, they may feel differently. And that's something that employers are going to want to make sure that they're really planning for. Related to this is, again, potentially accommodation-related risks. So what I was talking about just now with, employees having concerns about returning to work or not returning to work, those are issues of preference. An employee may, prefer to be in the physical workplace or prefer to work at home, but a different set of considerations to a certain extent applies when there's an actual accommodation need at play. And so similar to the constructive dismissal, risks here could be related to a variety of things. They could be related to family status. It may be that employees are saying, well, I don't have childcare, I don't have elder care, I can't afford the commute, I can't be that far away, I need to be at home, I need to be accessible. Or they may be saying, I'm feeling very anxious still. I don't think it's safe. I don't want to come back to work. And their anxiety may actually be at a sufficient level that it actually constitutes a medical issue and a mental health disability under the Human Rights Code and various legislations or the Human Rights Act. And so even though it's not always going to be an accommodation issue, sometimes it will be, and employers need to be prepared for that and make sure that they're asking the right questions. But keep in mind the entire time that, as Awana said in one of our previous segments, it's really the employer's responsibility to provide reasonable, not perfect accommodation. So employers aren't going to need to be giving employees necessarily exactly what employees want, but what employers are really going to have to consider is that they're going to have to provide a very clear, careful rationale because it is a different set of circumstances. Employees who have now been working from home, for 14 months and have heard employers say, this is going really well, productivity is up, we're being really efficient. When called back to work are going to say, well, why can't you accommodate me now? You've been accommodating me for so long, what's changed? And in a lot of circumstances, employers are going to be able to provide a very clear answer as to why that's preferable, but they just need to be prepared to make sure that's well articulated and covers the sort of objections that employees are most likely to raise. The other thing that employers are going to want to consider as we look back at our picture here is the constructive dismissal risks and the accommodation risks I've talked about. Those are certainly in effect at the local level, whether or on a wider geographic basis, whether the employee has been working remotely from 5 minutes away or 5 countries away. But remote work does trigger other legal frameworks and other jurisdictions that employers are really going to want to make sure that they're aware of because they may impact how the employer does business. So, for example, I'm sure many of you are aware of, I believe it was a few months ago that countries such as Barbados said, come work from home from Barbados for a year-long visa. We actually have clients who allowed employees to take advantage of some of these sorts of things. We've had employers who've come to us with requests for assistance when an employee is asked to work from Central America for 4 months or to work from India for half a year. So things like that, again, are certainly possible, but employers are going to want to make sure that they're aware of what they're committing to and what legal frameworks they may be subject to, because for legislation such as health and safety or employment standards, they differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And sometimes it's not entirely clear on its face what law applies when. So if I'm an employer based in Ontario and I have an employee who was hired in my Ontario office, but now works in BC and occasionally travels to Alberta, what health and safety framework applies when? Sometimes it's not what employers think. And that's something that should really be assessed before making any firm commitments to a return to a remote work arrangement for any specific employee. There are also implications related to a lot of areas of law outside of employment standards. So for example, tax law. I'm not going to go into the specifics of tax law by any means, but it's just something for employers to consider because one of the things that employer has to do is make sure that they're appropriately assessing withholdings and deductions, that they're appropriately reporting their financials, and where an employee is working and how long they may be out of the province, out of the country, can affect those things. And that's something for employers to consider. The other thing to consider just practically is that in a remote work context, some of the obligations that an employer may have are more difficult to fulfill. It's more difficult to monitor what's happening with employees. It's more difficult to plan and coordinate for what happens if things go wrong. If there's an equipment failure, it's not as easy to come into the office, use somebody else's equipment, things like that. So all of these things are things that employers really want to think about in advance as they formulate their strategies for exactly what the return to work is going to look like. And that brings me to the key takeaways that we want to share with you today. And so there's so much to say about where we work, but there are 4 things that I really want to focus on today. The first one is employers, you really need to be proactive and strategic. And, certainly, as we've said, when the entire pandemic situation started, many of us were skidding, running out of our offices with our arms full of electronic equipment. A lot of employers were caught flat-footed. And what the, unfortunate length of the pandemic has given employers time for now is to plan ahead. So going forward, as, vaccination rates are increasing, as employees are, and employers are considering the return to work, employers should really strategize and make sure that they know exactly what steps they want to take. When they're doing this, they want to make sure that they're considering potential ramifications, and also you want to make sure that you're aware of the workplace pulse. Because even in two organizations of roughly the same size, roughly the same geographical dispersion of employees, depending on how employees feel, depending on whether they want to return to the workplace or not, the challenges that the employer is going to face are going to be different. And being proactive and strategic, to a certain extent, also means being transparent and making sure that you clearly set expectations. If you, as the employer, are certain of the course that you're going to take, give employees notice. So going back to our story of the employee who came to their employer and said, look, I can't really be downtown in a small condo by myself. I'm going to move in with my employees, with my parents who live 4.5 hours away. In that case, what the employer did is said, okay, thanks for letting us know. Just to be clear, when we return to the workplace, part of the job duties for your position include these things that require you to be in the workplace. And we're still going to require you to do that. We don't have a firm return to work date, but you should plan for that. And so in that case, the employer made its position very clear so that, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months down the road, when it decided to set an actual return to work date, the employee couldn't come back and say, well, I was under the impression that, I could stay here 4.5 hours away and that I could work remotely, when that was never the employer's intention for how the workplace was going to run. And so the way that you're going to want to make sure that you've documented all this is, again, drafting and revising relevant policies. And this is something, we keep coming back to because it's just so key. Your policies are how you set the terms of the employment relationship. So with respect to where we work, there are a lot of different policies, again, that employers are going to want to consider because there are a lot of things in play. With respect to remote work itself, you're going to want to make sure that if this is something you're going to allow, if you're going to allow employees to be working, from their cottage for a few months of the year, or to go work from the Caribbean in the winter months, it should be very clear how an employee has to make the request, who they make the request to. If based on your workplace, there are different positions that are more suitable to remote work and some that really need to be located in a centralized office, you want to make sure that it's clear who gets to do it, who can actually work remotely, so that there are no surprises when an employee has a request denied. You want to make sure that it's clear how long any of these requests can go for, and that's something that's going to be determined in part by relevant legal frameworks in your jurisdiction that say, if an employee is out of the province, for example, for more than X amount of time, it may be a different system of laws that applies, and that's something that employers are going to need to consider. You're going to want to make sure that your policies also cover, what does the employee need to do? Do they need to do some research? Do they have to prepare a location? Do they have to provide you with some plans? Do they have to give you some information? You want to make sure that you're following those policies and getting all that information. You're also going to want to make sure in your policies that it's clear what happens when the remote work situation doesn't work out. So you want to obviously, if this is a benefit that you're now going to give to your employees and employees are excited about it, the employer is excited about it, that's fantastic. But as an employer, being proactive and strategic includes considering, well, what happens if it goes wrong, and having that predictability. So it may be that in your policies it says, well, if you're not being responsive, if this isn't working out, we may need to call you back. And then part of what the policy should consider is, who has to pay for that last minute ticket? Who's responsible for the arrangements? How is that all going to work out? Additionally, with issues and changes to where we're working, employers are going to want to revisit some of their employment standards related policies, like policies related to hours of work. If employees have been working a more flexible hours arrangement than before, and that's something the employer wants to continue going ahead, that's something that you should codify in your policies. If your policies haven't been followed and you want them to be followed, because you've seen that there are exposures related to hours of work, unapproved overtime, things like that, it's again good to take a look at the policies again and roll them out again. Make sure they're clearly communicated and reset expectations. And then if employees aren't following them, that gives you an avenue to discipline the employees for not following the expectations. Other policies that employers are going to want to consider that really aren't thought of as much, but are becoming increasingly important, are things related to your perquisites, your fringe benefits. So for example, If you have travel related policies where you reimburse employees for certain things if they're going on business trips, if you allow employees to expense certain items related to their work, if you're taking advantage of this increased employment mobility and your workforce now, instead of being very centralized, is interprovincial or international even, you may want to revisit your policies and either consider rolling out new ones or setting out specific carve-outs that make it clear that some employees in certain remote regions may not be eligible for certain of these perquisites. In addition to the policies, with all of the changes that have been happening, for a lot of employers, it's a good time to consider rolling out new employment agreements because, again, changes to things like work location and other related terms of employment can constitute a constructive dismissal if they're unilateral. And so employers are going to want to make sure that they put them to employees and have employees ideally agree to them in the new employment agreements. Additionally, when you're hiring new employees, if you've already determined that you're going to be an entirely remote workforce or that there's going to be some breakdown between work in the office and remote work, and your policies just say, we expect you to work at location X from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, you were going to want to change the employment agreement to make sure that it actually reflects what the circumstances of the employment relationships are going to be. Finally, with respect to some of these long-term, more exotic remote work arrangements, if you have policies and employment agreements that are solid, you're happy with them, they're enforceable, you may want to consider implementing remote work agreements specifically, because in those situations, they'll just reiterate some of the same content as the policies, but you can customize them to the employee's specific situation within your broader policy framework. And the nice thing about the remote work agreements that we've found in our practice as employers have implemented them to deal with some of these more exotic remote work arrangements is that, unlike an employment agreement, while this is something that employers want employees to sign, sometimes employees are less reluctant to sign off on a remote work agreement because it's something that they want, it's something that they're excited to have, rather than being asked to sign off on similar terms in an employment agreement where they may view it with concern and wonder, well, why are the, what I consider the basic terms of my employment changing in this way? And so with one last look at our woman on the beach there, I'm going to leave you with those takeaways and turn it over to Laura again.